I guess we call this a welcome shmooze, an orientation shmooze. So we're welcoming everybody. You had your orientation yesterday in the Ezras Nashim on the practical aspects of being in yeshiva. This is a conceptual orientation. We could ask, why are you here? Why'd you come? So, the beginning of this Zman always starts right in between two parshios, and all the lessons are in these two parshios that we need for this orientation shmooze. Parsha Shoftim, which opens with Shoftim v'Shotrim Titain Lecha B'chol She'arecha. And the Balei Machshava right away say, we're not talking to the community because otherwise it shouldn't have said Lecha. Lecha is singular. So we're talking to you. Shoftim are judges. Shotrim are the enforcers. In the political sense, it would be the judicial branch and the executive branch. Decisions. You need to have judgment. You need to think and make decisions. That's Shoftim. And you got to think about that. But after you make your decisions, then you got to walk your talk. We need shotrim. We need to implement. So every person, as an individual, has to have the ability to make proper judgments and then to actually implement. And then the continuation of the pasuk, b'chol she'arecha. What is this idea of kol she'arecha? Again, so the Balei Machshava say, a shar is a gate. It's a gateway. And a gateway, a shar, always leads somewhere. It leads to something significant. So, Elul, this is always the parsha in the beginning of Elul. Elul is a gateway. Elul is leading to a new year. And that's significant. And one of the things you want to ask is, how do you want your new year to be different than this year? That's going to be Shoftim. And you have to think about that. And then Shotrim, then you got to figure out how you're going to make it happen. I think they talk in the secular world, New Year's resolutions. That's one of the reasons we don't talk about New Year's resolutions. How long did New Year's resolutions last? About 2 days? 1 day? Okay, we want to know, how are you going to make it different? But you also came to yeshiva. That's a gateway. It's to lead to something significant. What is going to be different about you because you came to yeshiva? And after you think about what you want to be different, how are you going to make that difference happen? So I always like to open with a big compliment before we get into Musar. A big compliment that comes from Rabbi Yeshiva-Gateway that applies to you. Rabbi Yeshiva-Gateway viewed a Torah-observant Jew as a hero. What makes him a hero? There are instincts. You have drives. There's social pressure. There's expectations. There's background. And when you're all alone and nobody's looking, you decide to do what the Torah says to do. See, when you're in a society, when you're in public, when you're in an environment, there's a lot of social pressure to conform. I think that you've picked up already, now that you're in the Orthodox world for a little while, a lot of social pressure, a lot of conformity. But the question is, what happens when you're all alone and nobody's looking? And a Torah Jew refrains from what their instinct or the social pressure or whatever forces are at work, refrains from doing what's wrong because HaKadosh Baruch Hu said not to do it. That's a hero. Why do I call you guys heroes? Because you withstood your instinct, you withstood social pressure. I'm sure there was social pressure to get a job, to finish your career, to earn some money. What are you going to yeshiva for? And you overcame that instinct, you're a hero. So now that you got the compliment, what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with your decision to come to learn and to make a big sacrifice? So now we go to the next week's Parsha. There are two things in this coming week's Parsha, Ki Teitzei. One of them just is a more global realization of the richness of Torah Judaism. You go through the Parsha, and they cover every aspect. Bein Adam lechaveiro, and Bein Adam le'atzmo, and the community, and to God, and even how you relate to animals. Everything is covered. Monetary laws, and social laws, and marital law, everything is covered. That's all in Ki Teitzei. That's Judaism. So you got to realize it's not one-dimensional, multi-dimensional. But then we get to the real problem. Ki teitzei lamilchama al oivecha. You're about to do battle with your enemy. Well, does that talk to you guys sitting here in the Beis Medrash? I understand the soldier in Gaza needs instructions. Are you about to go out to war with an enemy? And it's your enemy? And the answer is yes. You know what your enemy is? Your enemy is the Yetzer Hara. You're always doing battle with the Yetzer Hara. Ki teitzei lamilchama al oivecha. You're doing battle with your Yetzer Hara. And we've got to know what is the Yetzer Hara that you're doing battle with. There's the obvious things, okay? Right? Eating something that might not have such a great hechsher, saying something you might not be able to say, watching things on the internet you probably shouldn't watch. That's easy Yetzer Hara. But the real deep Yetzer Hara that you're doing battle with. So one of our great mentors, Rav Nachman Bullman, and it's also, he got it from the Slonim Rebbe, the biggest Yetzer Hara of this generation is what's called Katnut Hadat. Rabbi Bullman called it being a pea brain. Looking at something in a very narrow way and not seeing the big, grand picture before us. You're sitting now in a time of unbelievable miracles, unbelievable opportunities, and you've got to appreciate the great, vast opportunities that are out there. And your Yetzer Hara is going to let you focus on some little tiny thing. Katnut Hadat. Dat means thinking the real, what's really out there. And to help you along, we always quote the opening line of Rabbi Sol Salanter in his Musar Sfarim, that a person is asur he's chofshi b'dimyono, the asur b'muskalo. Chofshi b'dimyono, he is free to roam the world with his imagination. You can imagine anything you want. Imagination runs free. But asur means you're tied up. Matir asurim, you're bound. The muskalo, with logic, with reality. And here's one of the challenges of our generation, and it certainly got much worse since Rabbi Yisrael Salanter's time, is that we live in a world of fantasy. You're surrounded by fantasy. And I've been giving the Shmuze for many years, and I can never cease to be amazed at how far out the fantasy goes. Okay, again, fantasy is advertising, fantasy is journalism, and now there's a fantasy about what's a man and what's a woman. What's reality? Nobody lives in reality. And says Rabbi Sol Salanter, that's fine. Your imagination can go anywhere you want. But you've got to live in reality. And reality is objective. So, you want to be in yeshiva to make sure that you are in reality. I call yeshiva learning a reality check. Make sure that you know what's real. How do I know what's real? Thinking. That's a lost art. Everybody wants to feel. Right? Today we make decisions based on feelings. What is, right? Ben Shapiro says everybody's entitled to their feelings. They're just not entitled to their facts. Facts are real. And learning Gemara, learning text, the reason we're so wedded to text is because it doesn't let you say whatever you want it to say. You got to say what the text says. And where did we get it from? We got it from Sinai. We're studying the Torah because the Torah is the revelation of reality. And when you do it right, it transforms your thinking. There's got to be a shift from katnut hadat, just seeing the little tiny things and ignoring the vast reality that confronts you and all the opportunities that are there. Stephen Covey talks about growth. And all growth, he says, requires paradigm shifts. You got to change the way you look at the world. And hopefully spending time in yeshiva and learning sources and learning authentic Torah Judaism will reorient how you look at the world. And paradigm shifts require you to look at the world in reality. Fantasy has lots and lots of ways to nail you. The Yetzer Hara works with fantasy. Now, again, it works with fantasy because you think all kinds of things that are not important are important. Okay? But you know what else? It even works with fantasy, and Rav Wolbe talks about this in a whole section. You can actually fantasize spiritual accomplishments. You could fantasize, right? Somebody reads the Chafetz Chaim Lashon Hara, and they could fantasize that they're perfect in Lashon Hara. They can fantasize that they're spiritual people. Okay, it's one of the things people like to do, all kinds of externals, right? People right away like to put on a suit and a black hat because it makes me feel from. Well, you didn't accomplish anything. But the externals make it look like you accomplished something. That's fantasy. So, paradigm shifts means you got to get away from fantasy and be real. And Judaism requires a lot of different paradigm shifts. One of them will start with studying Gemara. So when you went to university, or when you go to some trade school, you go to study for information. You want information. That's why we study. You probably, even if you're here just a couple of days, certainly if you've studied Gemara for a while, you realize that studying Gemara is probably the most inefficient way to get information. So what's it all about? It's about process. Studying Gemara is about process. We want to teach you. The Torah requires that you know how to think. I think it was mentioned yesterday at lunch. Think Jewish. Gemara teaches you how to think Jewish. Real thinking. So it's about process. Don't look for information. That's a huge paradigm shift. You're spending time to study for process. Another major paradigm shift, if you want to succeed in your Torah growth, is midos, character traits. You can be a great professor of chemistry or philosophy and be a corrupt person because you're teaching and you don't need to walk your talk. Torah requires midos. Torah requires character traits. Torah requires caring about another person. Torah requires caring about money that doesn't belong to you. Probably heard something about that in the orientation yesterday. There's yeshiva here with resources. If you waste the yeshiva resources, you're a thief. Because you're lacking sensitivity to somebody else. No se ba'olim chavero, caring about other people. These are midos. What does that have to do with learning Torah? What does that have to do with Judaism? That's what it's all about. You want to grow. So, Covey has something, if you study Stephen Covey, you've read it, The Law of the Farm. Growth is slow. Right? He uses the story of the farmer who came to university. You guys were in university, right? You had an assignment at the beginning of the semester. These are the books, these are the papers, and you have 10 weeks to finish it. And I hope I'm not going to embarrass anybody. Most of you probably goofed off for 9 weeks and crammed it all in the last week. And you did okay. So the farmer comes to university, sees these kids goofing off for 9 weeks, and then he crams for a week. And they did good. So the farmer says to himself, I'm a jerk. I plow in September, I plant in October, I fertilize in November, I wait for the rain in October, and 6 months, and then I get a crop. Well, I can do all that. It doesn't take 6 months, it takes 2 weeks. I can plow and I can plant and I can water. So 2 weeks before the harvesting season, he does all that. And of course, what happens? No. There's the law of the farm. There's reality. Growth is slow. You want to grow, there's no silver bullet. In America, everybody likes instant solutions. Okay? There's no instant solution. There's no instant growth. And there's another point you have to realize. When you plant tomato seeds, do you expect to get corn? No. You plant the tomato seeds, you're going to get tomatoes. You guys have to ask, what am I planting? You reap what you sow. And you've got to plant the seeds. You've got to work and have patience and time. You got to put in the time. You got to work and not expect instant results. You might think it doesn't really matter if I am at night Seder, I'm not at night Seder. I love to quote the letters I used to get when there were still things called letters. You know what a letter is? You know, people wrote something and they sent me a mail. So I have letters in my files from more than one alum writing how great the experience was at Shapell's. I just wish I had spent more time in night Seder. I never once got a letter saying, why did I spend so much time at night Seder? Never heard that. You got to spend the time. Every minute counts. And you got to really feel that. So this is your shotrim to do after you've done your shoftim. When you think, what are you trying to accomplish? How are you going to accomplish it? And then you got to start walking your talk. There's another paradigm shift that's very complicated. In the Western world, you guys grew up, we want answers. There are questions, there are challenges, and we want answers. And the last thing we want is paradox. Paradox means, well, you know, it's how can we have both? It's got to either be X or it's got to be Y. And Judaism lives with paradox. You want some examples? You're created as an individual. In America, all you care about is your individuality. It's all about me. Judaism says, yes, you're an individual, and you have responsibility to the community. And you are going to have to balance that. Because on the one hand, you're here for your own growth, and yet Judaism says you can't grow by yourself. The Maharal talks about this in many places. Torah was not given to the individual. Torah was given to Klal Yisrael only when there were 600,000 Jews. You need a tzibur, you need a Klal Yisrael. And if you think that you can acquire Torah as an iconoclast and you're going to just worry about yourself, you should know up front you cannot acquire Torah that way. You're part of a tzibur. And therefore your individual decisions also have to take into account how does it impact on the tzibur and how does it keep me connected to the tzibur. And that starts with davening in the morning. It goes to in Shabbos, it goes to Tiyulim, it goes to being a good friend to all the people, tzibur, being part of the tzibur. That's a paradox. Because on the one hand you're an individual and and your responsibility is to yourself. And yet Judaism says part of your responsibility to yourself is to be connected to the tzibur. And we got to balance that. Freedom of choice. You have absolute freedom of choice. But freedom of choice means you have a responsibility to choose smart. That's a bit of a paradox. You can do whatever you want, but you're required to do to choose correctly. We want independent thinkers. We don't want robots. We don't want tape recorders. And too many people walk around and their Judaism is just tape recorders. They're just robots without really understanding what they're doing. So there has to be independent thinking. And yet, you are bound by a Masorah. You are bound by a Torah that came from Sinai. And you got to figure out how to balance that. That's a challenge. One of my more recent favorite ones, privilege. So today, I think when you accuse somebody of having privilege, it's viewed very negatively. I think the phrase now is white privilege, and you don't even realize you have it, and therefore it's something wrong with you because of your white privilege. Well, guess what, guys? You have privilege. You have privilege because you're a Jew, which is a privilege to be a Jew. And you say it every morning, Baruch Elokeinu, Shebra'anu Lichvodo. You were privileged to be a recipient of God's Torah and implement His mission. But that privilege comes with responsibility. It doesn't give you extra rights. It gives you extra responsibilities. And that, you've got to feel the privilege. It's a privilege to be here in Israel, in yeshiva, learning Torah. We always talk about how 3 or 4 or 5 generations ago, you would tell a Jew in Europe that he can come to Israel, but it's going to, something serious concept. I don't want to use the examples. They would have given anything to come to Israel. And you guys just got on a plane. And you don't appreciate the privilege. You don't appreciate you're in the katnut hadat. Your attitude towards it is pea-brain. Instead of looking at the vast privilege of living Jewish history, but not Jewish history, living Jewish prophecy. Pay attention to the Haftorahs now that they're reading after Tisha B'Av. And if you think and read them carefully, many of them describe current events. We're living the fulfillment of prophecy. Do you appreciate that? That requires a big picture look. That requires getting away from the Yetzer Hara of little tiny details and seeing the big picture. But here's part of the paradox. You can't live in a big picture fantasy because I think the phrase is, and we believe that, God is in the details. Halacha is very detailed. Okay? And washing Netilat Yadayim properly and saying every word in benching and making sure that you're saying Tefillah B'tzibur, those are little details. They all matter. And I'm just using simplistic examples. That's paradox. Details and big picture have to coexist. Elul is leading to the new year. You just came to yeshiva or you're continuing. These are opportunities. They're gateways. They're sha'arim. They are gateways. Gateways can lead to lots of different places. Ask yourselves, what do you want to accomplish? Why are you here? You made tremendous sacrifices. I just got to go back and say, you guys are heroes. The fact that you're here, against all the pressures, all the challenges that you had to forego in order to be here. But now make sure that you make it pay off. And that requires shoftim, good judgment, shotrim, implement, walk your talk. And my closing words are, we're all here to help you.